Picture this. You're a young Viking warrior named Bjorn, barely 18 summers old, sitting on a rough-hewn bench in a chieftain's longhouse. The air is thick, a suffocating cocktail of wood smoke, roasting meat, spilled ale, and the damp, earthy smell of dozens of unwashed bodies pressed together. The roar of the fire in the central hearth is matched by the roar of your comrades, their boasts and laughter echoing off the soot-blackened timbers. They are celebrating a successful raid, drinking from polished horns, their faces ruddy in the flickering light, their beards glistening with grease. A skald, a poet-historian, is chanting tales of Odin's cunning and Thor's might, stories of gods who are masters of their own destiny, who take what they desire without question. But you are not listening to the skald. Your attention is fixed across the fire, where Leif, a warrior who stood shield to shield with you on the shores of Northumbria, catches your eye. There is no manly softness in his gaze. It is as hard and grey as the northern sea. Yet in the space of a heartbeat, a silent understanding passes between you, an acknowledgement of a shared secret that is more dangerous than any Saxon axe. In this hall, a man's worth is measured in his strength, the thickness of his arm rings, and the number of sons he can sire. To be a man is to be a rock, a pillar of unyielding masculinity. But what happens when that rock develops a crack? This is not the story of the hyper-masculine Viking you see in movies, the one-dimensional berserker whose only desires are for gold, glory, and a willing shield maiden. This is the untold history of a far more complex reality. A world where a man's honour was a razor's edge, where the lines between the fierce brotherhood of the shield wall and a forbidden desire were blurred in the smoke of the longhouse, and where the wrong kind of love could get you killed, not by an enemy's sword, but by the hands of your own kin. This is a story of survival in a society that had a name for men like you, a word so vile it could strip you of your rights, your name, and your very humanity. Before we drag these secrets out of the darkness and into the firelight, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden, often brutal truths of the past, consider taking a moment to strike that like button and subscribe for more journeys into forgotten history. And please leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining this expedition from. It's a powerful thing to think that we are all connected across oceans and continents, exploring these ancient, dangerous stories together. Now let's return to Bjorn's world, where the greatest insult was not to be called a coward, but to be called a woman. The entire structure of Norse society rested on a brutal and unforgiving pyramid of power and perception. A man was defined by his ability to dominate, to penetrate, whether that meant penetrating an enemy's shield wall with his spear, penetrating the soil with his plough to bring forth life, or penetrating his wife to create heirs. Action, aggression, and dominance were the pillars of Viking masculinity. To be passive, to be receptive, was to be feminine. And in this world, there was no greater shame for a man than to be associated with the feminine. This wasn't just social preference, it was a concept so deeply ingrained that it had a legal and spiritual name, ergi. Ergi is a word that doesn't translate easily into modern English. It's not simply homosexuality or effeminacy. It was a profound spiritual and social stain, a label that signified a man who willingly took the receptive, submissive role in sex with another man. To be accused of ergi was to be branded an agra man, a creature beneath contempt. This accusation, known as need, was the most potent form of slander imaginable. Imagine a word so venomous, so utterly soul-destroying that the moment it left a person's lips, the law itself permitted you to draw steel and kill them where they stood, without penalty. That was the power of a nid accusation. Why was it so devastating? Because an Agra man was seen as having forfeited his masculinity. He was considered weak, unreliable, and magically contaminated. He lost all legal standing. He could not bear witness in a legal case, could not inherit property, and could not be considered a man of honour. He was, in essence, a social ghost, an outcast whose very presence was an insult to the men around him. The sagas, the great epic poems of the Norse world, are filled with instances of these accusations. In the saga of the people of Laxardal, a character named Hrafn is so enraged by an insult from his rival Kjartan that he builds an entire series of obscene, carved figures, nidstong or spite poles, depicting Kjartan and his companion in submissive sexual positions, a public and catastrophic shaming. This terror of being perceived as receptive created a bizarre and dangerous paradox at the heart of Viking intimacy. The taboo was not necessarily about a man having sex with another man, it was about which man was in the position of power. The dominant, penetrating partner did not suffer the same stain of ergi. In fact, forcing another man into a submissive role could be seen as an ultimate act of domination, a way of asserting one's own hypermasculinity by symbolically turning a rival into a woman. This perverse logic meant that sexual violence between men, particularly against enemies or those of lower status, could be framed as an act of power rather than a forbidden desire. This created a terrifyingly precarious landscape for someone like Bjorn. He and Leif are equals, brothers pals in arms. There is no clear power dynamic. The silent question hanging in the smoky air between them is not just about desire, but about status and survival. Who would be the dominant one? Who would be the submissive? The act itself, if discovered, could be interpreted in two completely different ways. One man might walk away with his reputation tarnished but intact. The other would be destroyed, branded with the soul-crushing label of Arga. The all-male environments of Viking life, the close quarters of a longship on a months-long voyage, the enforced intimacy of a winter camp, the testosterone-fueled atmosphere of the training yard, were pressure cookers for these unspoken tensions. They were environments that fostered intense homosocial bonds, a deep abiding love between warriors who depended on each other for their very lives. But it was a love that could never be spoken, a desire that, if acted upon, forced a terrifying gamble, where one man's pleasure could mean another man's complete social annihilation. As Bjorn looks at Leif, he understands this gamble perfectly. The warmth he feels is not the comforting heat of the longhouse fire, but the dangerous heat of a secret that could burn his entire world to the ground. The fire crackles and sitters, casting dancing shadows that writhe like captured spirits on the walls of the longhouse. Bjorn's gaze is still locked with Leif's, a silent, taut conversation happening across the roaring hearth. The Skald has finished his tale of Thor's brute strength, and now begins a darker, more complex story. A story of the All-Father Odin. And as the words fill the hall, a cold dread, mingled with a strange sense of validation, washes over Bjorn. He learns, as all Viking boys do, that Odin is the god of war, of kings, of the glorious death that leads to Valhalla. He is the ultimate patriarch, the chieftain of the gods. But the Skald's poem weaves a more complicated truth, a truth that whispers of a different kind of power, a power rooted in shame. Odin, the god of warriors, is also the master of Seda, a form of magic so steeped in the feminine, so profoundly tied to the concept of ergi, that any mortal man who practiced it would be ostracized and destroyed. This is the great terrifying paradox at the heart of the Norse faith. The god they prayed to for masculine strength was himself a practitioner of the most unmanly arts. Seda was not the magic of clashing swords and brute force. It was a subtle, insidious power. The magic of prophecy, of manipulating fate, of weaving spells that could cloud men's minds or bring them ruin. It was a magic of reception. The practitioner, often a woman known as a vulva, would enter a trance sitting upon a high seat, allowing visions and spirits to enter her, to speak through her. The chants were high-pitched. The posture was passive. The power was received, not taken. For a man whose entire identity was built on aggressive, forceful action, to engage in Seda was to willingly place himself in the receptive, feminine position. It was to become the vessel, not the spear. It was, in essence, a magical form of the sexual submission that defined an Arga man. This wasn't a subtle interpretation. It was a core belief. The sagas are explicit about it. To be a Seidmarder, a male magic user, was to be tainted with ergi by default. And yet Odin, the god of gods, was the master of this art. He had learned it from the goddess Freya, and he wielded it without shame to gain knowledge and power that brute force could never achieve. This divine hypocrisy hangs in the air of the longhouse, as thick as the smoke. Bjorn feels it in his own bones. The most famous account of this accusation comes from the epic poem, the Lokasenna, where the trickster god Loki stands in the halls of Asgard and systematically exposes the secrets and shames of every god and goddess present. When he turns his venomous tongue on Odin, he delivers the most devastating insult of all. He accuses Odin of practicing Seda on the island of Samsi, striking a drum and wandering among the people like a witch, claiming he was of an unmanly mind. This is not just a casual insult. This is a formal public accusation of ergi against the king of the gods. And what is Odin's response? He doesn't deny it. He can't. Instead, he retorts by bringing up one of Loki's own transgressions. The implication is staggering. The All-Father's practice of this forbidden magic is an open secret, a source of power so great that he is willing to endure the associated shame. He sacrifices everything for knowledge and power. He gives his eye for a drink from the well of Mimir. He hangs himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights to learn the runes, and he sacrifices his masculine honour to become the master of Seda. For a mortal man like Bjorn, this is a profoundly confusing and dangerous lesson. On the one hand, it creates a crack in the monolithic wall of Viking masculinity. It suggests that the boundaries are not as absolute as the boasts of the warriors around him would suggest. There are other forms of power, other ways of being. But on the other hand, it reinforces the immense danger of crossing those boundaries. Odin is a bull. He can contain these contradictions. A mortal man cannot. For a mortal, to follow Odin's path of magic is not to become a god, but to become an outcast. The exception proves the terrifying rule. This divine drama is further complicated by the other figures in the Norse pantheon. There is Thor, the ideal of straightforward, unthinking masculinity. When his hammer is stolen and he is forced to dress as the goddess Freya to get it back, the story is played for comedy, but it's a comedy rooted in his profound humiliation. He is seething with rage throughout the ordeal. It is an unbearable shame he must endure, and he washes it clean with violence the moment his hammer is back in his hand. Thor's story reinforces the mainstream view, gender bending as a degradation. Then there is Loki, the ultimate transgressor. He is not bound by any rule. He changes his shape and his sex at will. He is the ultimate Agra figure, famously transforming into a mare to seduce the giant stallion Svadilfari, and subsequently giving birth to Odin's 8-legged steed, Sleipnir. Loki's story is a cautionary tale. His constant violation of natural and social order, including the norms of gender and sexuality, is what makes him a force of chaos, a being who ultimately helps bring about Ragnarok, the destruction of the world. As Bjorn sits there, the firelight warming one side of his face while a cold sweat breaks out on the other, he sees this divine pantheon reflected in the men around him. Most are like Thor, loud, proud, and terrified of any hint of softness. They would rather die than be shamed. But in Leif he sees something else. Quiet cunning, a watchfulness, a hint of Odin's dangerous wisdom. Is that what draws him in? The possibility of a connection that transcends the simple, brutal rules of the Longhouse? The stories of the gods offer no comfort. They do not provide a safe harbour for his feelings. Instead, they lay out a map of a spiritual landscape fraught with peril, where the line between power and perversion, between a god's sacrifice and a man's damnation, is terrifyingly thin. The smoke stings his eyes. Or maybe it's something else. He understands that the fear of ergi is not just a social convention, it is a cosmic terror, written into the very fabric of his religion. The chieftain raises his horn, and a temporary silence falls over the Longhouse, a brief dam against the river of noise. He is making a ruling in a dispute between two farmers over a stolen sheep, his judgment swift and final. It is a reminder to Bjorn that in this world every action has a consequence, every transgression has a price. The law is not an abstract concept, it is a living, breathing force as real as the chieftain's axe hanging on the post behind him. And as Bjorn watches, his mind inevitably drifts to the most terrifying laws of all, the ones that are not spoken of in boasts but whispered in warnings, the laws that govern men's bodies and their desires, the laws that could turn a respected warrior into a hunted animal. The Viking legal system, as pieced together from ancient texts like the Gragas, the law code of the Icelandic Commonwealth, was obsessed with maintaining honour and social order, and nothing threatened that order more than the stain of ergi. The law was brutally clear on this point. The accusation of need was not just slander, it was a legal trigger. If a man called another Aga or Raga, or used any of the kennings, the poetic euphemisms that meant the same thing, such as the mare's mate or the one who is ridden, the accused man had the legal right to kill his accuser on the spot. This wasn't vigilantism. It was legally sanctioned self-defense, a lesser outlawry that allowed for an immediate lethal response to a catastrophic attack on one's honour. But what if the accusation was true? What if a man was caught in the act? Or if his submissive behaviour was so well known that it became common knowledge? The law had provisions for that too, and they were far more chilling than a quick death in a duel. A man proven to be ergi became a full outlaw. This wasn't just exile. To be declared an outlaw was to be stripped of your humanity. You were no longer a person in the eyes of the law. You were a wolf, a varga, a creature to be hunted. Any man could kill you without penalty and, in fact, would be rewarded for doing so. Your property was confiscated, your marriage was dissolved, your children were declared fatherless. You were erased from the social fabric. This is the fate that haunts Bjorn's silent contemplation. The desire he feels for Leif is not a simple matter of the heart. It is a potential death sentence, a one-way ticket to becoming a social phantom, hunted by the very men he now calls brothers. The law codes detail the specifics with a chilling pragmatism. The use of need was so powerful that it could be employed as a weapon in legal and political disputes. A man could be disqualified from bringing a case to the Althing, the General Assembly, if his opponent could successfully argue that he was ergi. His testimony would be worthless, his claims invalid. It was the ultimate character assassination, a way of destroying a man's credibility so completely that he might as well be a bleating sheep. The fear of this legal and social annihilation permeated every aspect of a man's life. It governed the way he walked, the way he talked, the pitch of his voice. Any perceived softness, any deviation from the rigid script of masculinity, could invite suspicion. This created an environment of constant performance, where men were under relentless pressure to project an image of unassailable strength and heterosexuality. The sagas provide grim illustrations of this legal reality. They tell stories of men who are goaded into fighting to the death over insults to their manliness. In the saga of Bjorn, champion of the Hittardal people, the hero is constantly taunted by his rival Thord, who spreads poetic verses mocking him for being effeminate and for supposedly being the passive partner to a man in a foreign land. Bjorn is forced to spend years of his life hunting Thord down, driven by the need to wash away this stain with blood. The story is a tragedy, a life consumed by the need to disprove a single poisonous accusation. The violence isn't just about personal anger, it's about reasserting one's legal and social standing in the only way the culture allowed. This legal framework also had terrifying implications for victims of sexual assault. In a culture where the ultimate shame was to be penetrated, a man who was raped by another man was often seen as being just as contaminated as a man who consented. The stain of ergi was on him regardless of his consent. The shame was so profound that it was often seen as something that could only be cleansed by revenge. If the victim failed to take vengeance, he himself could be seen as weak and unmanly, forever tainted by the act. This put male rape victims in an impossible position: suffer in shamed silence, or embark on a potentially deadly feud to reclaim their honour. There was no concept of victimhood as we understand it today, only the brutal binary of dominant and submissive. This legal structure creates a landscape of total sexual paranoia. For Bjorn, even a moment of tenderness with Leif, a shared glance that lingers too long, is a risk. Any witness could interpret the scene in the most damaging way possible. A rival seeing an opportunity to gain an advantage could twist a moment of friendship into an accusation of ergi. The burden of proof was often flimsy, resting on rumour, innuendo, and the public perception of a man's character. Once the seed of doubt was planted, it was nearly impossible to uproot. As the chieftain concludes his business and the ale horns are refilled, the noise in the longhouse swells once more. But for Bjorn, the sound is different now. He hears the undercurrent of anxiety beneath the boisterous laughter. He sees the constant, subtle jockeying for position, the way men square their shoulders, deepen their voices, and perform their masculinity for each other. The law is not just a set of rules written on vellum. It is a cage of expectations, and the threat of being branded ergi is the key that could lock him inside forever. He looks at life again, and the handsome, weathered face he desires is suddenly overlaid with a skull, a premonition of the outlaw's fate. The love he feels is a crime, not just against the gods, but against the very laws of men. It's a crime for which the punishment is not just death, but utter and complete erasure. The fire in the longhouse is burning lower now, the once roaring flames reduced to a sullen, glowing heart of embers. Some men have fallen asleep where they sit, their heads slumped on the trestle tables, their snores adding a rhythmic guttural bassline to the murmuring hall. The air has cooled, and the world outside the heavy wooden doors has fallen silent. This is the time for secrets, the time when the shield of public performance can be lowered, just slightly. As Bjorn watches Leif, he thinks of the world beyond this fjord, the lands they have seen from the prow of a longship. He thinks of the monks in their stone monasteries, the merchants in their bustling towns, and the strange customs of the people they have raided and traded with. He begins to wonder if this suffocating cage of masculinity is a uniquely Norse affliction, or if the whole world lives in fear. The Viking expansion across Europe and the North Atlantic brought their rigid cultural and sexual norms into direct contact with a vast array of other societies, and the results were often a cocktail of contempt, confusion, and brutal assertion of dominance. When Viking raiders sacked a monastery in England or Ireland, they weren't just seeking gold and silver. They were crashing into a world with a completely different understanding of masculinity. The celibate, unarmed monk devoted to a god who preached turning the other cheek was the absolute antithesis of the Viking ideal. To a warrior like Bjorn, these men were baffling, almost alien. Their lack of aggression, their devotion to books instead of blades, would have been interpreted as a profound form of ergi. Historical accounts from the Christian side, like the writings of Alcuin of York after the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793, are filled with horror at the Vikings' brutality. But from the Viking perspective, their actions would have been entirely logical. They were dealing with a population of men they perceived as unmanly, and therefore as deserving of domination. The chroniclers record the murder of monks and the carrying off of treasure, but the sagas and the Viking legal code suggest a darker reality. Forcing sexual submission upon these men would have been, in the Viking mindset, the ultimate way to demonstrate their contempt and solidify their own masculine superiority. It was a form of psychological warfare, a way of branding an entire community with the stain of ergi. This clash of cultures created a feedback loop of hatred. The Christians saw the Vikings as godless savages, agents of Satan. The Vikings saw the Christians, particularly their male clergy, as weak, pathetic, and fundamentally unmanly, ripe for conquest and humiliation. This worldview wasn't limited to their interactions with Christians. As they pushed east into the Slavic lands and south to the Byzantine Empire, they encountered different cultures, but their lens of judgment remained the same. A man's worth was measured by his martial prowess and his performance of dominance. Any culture that valued other traits, scholarship, artistry, diplomacy, was viewed with suspicion and often contempt. However, the tide of history was turning against the world of Thor and Odin. The tendrils of Christianity were creeping into Scandinavia itself, first through missionaries and merchants, and later through the conversion of powerful kings and chieftains who saw political advantage in aligning with the Christian kingdoms of Europe. The arrival of this new faith brought with it a completely different, though equally restrictive set of sexual ethics. Christianity didn't have a concept identical to ergi. It had the concept of sodomy. This was a crucial shift. While the Norse obsession was with the passive role and the preservation of masculine honour, the Christian prohibition was against the act itself, regardless of who was dominant or submissive. To the Church, any non-procreative sexual act was a sin against God's natural law. A man having sex with another man was a mortal sin for both participants. There was no loophole for the dominant partner. Both souls were in peril of eternal damnation. As this new religion began to take root, a profound and confusing transition occurred. The old fear of being shamed as Argo in this life began to merge with the new fear of being damned as a sodomite in the next. For a man like Bjorn, this would have been a deeply unsettling change. The old system, for all its brutality, had a perverse kind of logic he could understand. It was about honour and power. The new system introduced a new invisible terror, the state of one's eternal soul. This shift is visible in the later sagas and law codes. As Iceland and Norway officially converted to Christianity in the 11th century, the old pagan laws were gradually replaced or amended with ecclesiastical law. The prohibitions against ergi didn't disappear, but they were reframed. It was no longer just a social crime against a man's honour, it was a spiritual crime against God. The punishment was no longer just being declared an outlaw in the world of men, but the threat of hellfire in the world to come. This fusion of pagan shame culture and Christian sin culture created an even more repressive environment. A man now had to fear not only the judgment of his peers in the Longhouse, but also the all-seeing eye of a god who condemned the desire itself, not just the dishonourable act. This transition also changed the nature of male relationships. The intense, emotionally charged brotherhood of the pre-Christian warrior band, was viewed with new suspicion by church authorities. The love between shield brothers, once celebrated in poetry, was now seen as a potential breeding ground for sodomy. The church promoted a different ideal, the chaste brotherhood of monks, or the sanctified union of husband and wife. Anything that fell outside these narrow channels was suspect. As Bjorn and Leif sit in the dying light of the fire, they are living on the cusp of this change. They are the last generation for whom the old rules of ergi are the primary concern. Their children would be born into a world where the village priest's sermon held as much as the chieftain's judgment. The fear of social erasure would be compounded by the fear of eternal damnation. The silent space between them is no longer just filled with the risk of being outlawed. It is now populated by demons and the threat of hellfire. The arrival of Christianity didn't erase the Viking taboo. It absorbed it, sanctified it, and gave it a new and terrifying theological weight that would shape Scandinavian attitudes towards homosexuality for the next 1,000 years. The last log on the fire collapses into a cascade of brilliant embers, a final silent firework in the near-total darkness of the longhouse. The deep rhythmic breathing of the sleeping warriors is the only sound. In this hushed, intimate moment, the suffocating weight of law and religion seems to lift, just for a moment, and in this quiet, Bjorn allows himself to wonder, is survival possible? In a world so violently opposed to their very existence, was there any way for two men to love each other? Was there a hidden language, a secret path through this cultural minefield? The official record, written in the stone of law codes and the blood of the sagas, screams a resounding no. It presents a world of absolute conformity where transgression meant death or erasure. But history is never so simple. The loudest voices are often those of the powerful, the lawmakers, the skalds paid to sing the praises of chieftains. The quiet lives of ordinary people, their secret rebellions and their small acts of defiance, rarely make it into the epic poems. To find traces of men like Bjorn and Leif, we must learn to read between the lines, to listen for the whispers in the silence. One of the most tantalizing clues comes from the Norse practice of blood brotherhood. The fostbræðralag, or foster brotherhood, was a sacred rite where two men, not related by birth, would swear oaths of eternal loyalty to each other. They would literally mingle their blood in a ritual, often by cutting their palms and pressing them together under a strip of raised turf, symbolically entering the earth and being reborn as brothers. They swore to protect each other, to share wealth, and most importantly, to avenge each other's death as if they were true kin. The sagas celebrate these bonds as the pinnacle of male loyalty. The relationship between the heroes Gunnar and Njal in Njal's saga, or the fierce devotion of the warriors in the Jomsviking brotherhood, are held up as ideals. On the surface, this was a purely homosocial, non-sexual institution designed to create powerful alliances in a violent world. But could it also have served as a cover? Could this socially sanctioned, celebrated ritual of male intimacy have provided a legitimate space for men like Bjorn and Leif to formalize their bond in the only way their culture would permit? Within the sacred context of the fostbræðralag, a level of emotional and physical closeness that would otherwise be suspect became not only acceptable but honourable. A blood brother could share a bed closet with you for warmth, stand closer to you than any other man, and show a level of devotion that would be unthinkable for mere friends. The ritual provided a perfect bulletproof alibi. Their intense connection was not a forbidden desire, it was a sworn oath of warrior loyalty, an institution blessed by the community. It is impossible to know how many of these sworn brotherhoods were also loving partnerships, but it remains one of the most plausible avenues for survival. Another hint of a hidden world comes from the very thing used to condemn them: language. The existence of the word ergi and the elaborate web of need insults, while demonstrating a powerful taboo, also proves something else. The behaviour it described was common enough to require a specific and powerful vocabulary to police it. Societies do not invent powerful legal and social sanctions for things that never happen. The sheer intensity of the prohibition against male passivity is, in itself, evidence that it was a recurring feature of Viking society. Furthermore, the use of kennings and poetic language, which was central to Norse culture, could also provide a means of secret communication. Just as a skald could craft a clever insult to destroy a man's reputation, two men could potentially use the same linguistic subtlety to express their feelings for each other in ways that would be opaque to outsiders. A shared look, a particular phrase, a reference to a myth. These could form a coded language, a private world operating in plain sight. We can also look for clues in the liminal spaces of Viking society, the places where the rules were slightly relaxed. The life of a travelling merchant or a warrior serving in the Varangian Guard in faraway Constantinople took a man outside the constant surveillance of his home village. In these more anonymous cosmopolitan environments, there might have been more freedom to form relationships that would have been impossible back home. The sagas themselves, for all their hyper-masculine focus, sometimes betray a different reality. They are filled with moments of intense, passionate emotion between men that verge on the romantic. The profound grief of a warrior for his fallen shield brother is often described in language far more passionate than that used to describe his feelings for his wife. While these are framed as expressions of warrior camaraderie, it's not hard to see how a genuine romantic love could be hidden within this accepted emotional template. The love was real. It was merely given a name that society could accept. As dawn begins to filter through the smoke hole in the roof of the longhouse, casting a pale grey light on the sleeping forms, Bjorn feels a flicker of something that is not quite hope, but a grim determination. The world is a brutal, unforgiving place. The risks are immense, but perhaps not impossible. He looks at Leif, who is stirring now, his eyes opening to meet Bjorn's in the growing light. Maybe the answer is not to break the rules, but to bend them. To forge a bond so strong, so pure in its loyalty, that society has no choice but to celebrate it. To become blood brothers. To use the very tools of the system, its oaths, its rituals, its celebration of warrior loyalty. To create a space for themselves. It would be a life lived on a knife's edge. A constant performance where one wrong step could lead to disaster. Their love would have to be disguised as brotherhood. Their passion sublimated into shared violence against their enemies. Their tenderness hidden in the gruff intimacy of the shield wall. This is the final tragic reality for men like Bjorn. There was no gay liberation in the Viking Age. There was no coming out. There was only the quiet, desperate, and incredibly courageous act of finding love and building a life in the darkest of shadows, using the language of honour and brotherhood to hide a secret that could never be spoken. The story of Viking homosexuality is not a story of pride flags and parades. It is a story of survival against impossible odds, a testament to the resilience of human connection in the face of a culture designed to crush it. It's a story written in silence, in shared glances across a fire, and in the mingled blood of a sacred secret oath.